this does something magical to the whole genre and the relationship with the genre in Soviet society and politics and culture. In other words, science fiction suddenly becomes legit. The Soviet side was a lot more uneven, heterogeneous, and independent than we like to think. American audiences and critics are perhaps a little more provincial than they like to think of themselves.
First, real non-approved American film I ever saw was The Running Man. The film completely destroyed all of my perceptions of what the movie is. I've never seen Schwarzenegger before, and I never knew people could be like that.
Naked Pravda.
Hello there, you're listening to The Naked Pravda. I'm your host, Kevin Rotrok, Medusa's English language managing editor. And on today's show, we're going to talk about Soviet science fiction. Mostly sci-fi movies, but some talk of literature slips in as well. I actually have a bit of a personal relationship with Soviet movies. I didn't start studying the Russian language until I was about 18, and that was when I was a freshman at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I went to undergraduate school. I started just kind of on my own, visiting the school library to watch movies like Ballad of a Soldier, The Cranes Are Flying, Come and See, oof, I remember that one. Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears, Autumn Marathon, To Kill a Dragon, that's a good one. And then there were some post-Soviet films too, like Brother, Burned by the Sun. The college actually hosted screenings of Russian Ark, and The Return, and even Night Watch. And that last one was possible because I actually returned home from studying abroad in Moscow with a bootlegged DVD of Night Watch. So you're welcome, UC Santa Cruz, circa 2003 or whatever. Maybe it was 2004. Anyway, this was all, obviously, almost 20 years ago, when it still wasn't very easy to find access to these films online from home. And, I had to go to this dedicated space in the library to see this stuff. And the film library in UC Santa Cruz was, or maybe still is, underground on the bottom floor of the building. And going there, you actually felt a bit like you were walking into a science lab yourself. This is also where I saw Andrei Tarkovsky's sci-fi epic Solaris and Stalker, which were released in 1972 and 1979. If you've ever seen a Tarkovsky film, you know it's a rich, very challenging experience. Watching these movies was an important part of my education about Russia, but I'm a child of Hollywood first and foremost. That's maybe why I took such an interest recently in an internet meme I saw making the rounds on social media last month. The image compares movie aliens in Soviet and American films, contrasting the familiar, mostly attractive humanoids of Soviet cinema to the horrifying monsters of movies like Predator, The Thing, Alien, and apparently a 1983 British sci-fi movie called Extro. I had never heard of it. I haven't seen it. It looks interesting. And also terrible. Anyway, the meme was clearly suggesting that Soviet filmmakers embraced the outside world, while Americans and Westerners are a bunch of scared xenophobes. Only a xenophobe could dream up the xenomorph, I guess. This dumb internet meme got me thinking. Of course, there's no denying that Hollywood captures and expresses many of the biases and the fears inherent in American society. But what can we learn from comparing Soviet sci-fi movies to sci-fi movies made in Hollywood and in the West? How different are these two worlds of cinema? That's the subject of this week's show.
I'm going to actually push against that binary a little bit because it's a little more complicated than saying that there is this contrast.
That's Anindita Bannerджи, an associate professor at Cornell University's Department of Comparative Literature, whose research focuses on science fiction and technocultural studies, environmental humanities, media studies, and migration studies across Russia, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and Latin and African Americas. She serves on the faculty advisory board of the Atkinson Center for Sustainability and as the chair of the Humanities Concentration in the Environment and Sustainability Program. Professor Bannerджи has written extensively about Soviet science fiction, and she warned me that the USSR and the USA have more in common here than many might assume.
Obviously, conditions of production were very different, starting with access to space and film stock and so forth, and getting past, the bureaucracy of censorship, and all of this was very different in the Soviet Union. But in terms of, if you want to think about science fiction as a kind of an education in imagining otherwise, a kind of an education in desires and aspirations, then I think that we find a lot more similarities, and also the fact that the Soviet side was a lot more uneven, heterogeneous, and independent than we like to think.
Dr. Bannerджи argues that the space age, which made science fiction a truly global, popular phenomenon, inspired Soviet and American writers and filmmakers alike. With these shared roots, how much sense does it really make to treat these cultures as so distinct?
The way that I like to think about this space age that I've written quite extensively about is also this weird mirroring, because it was because of the Sputnik launch and the beginning of the space race that American readers and academics even began to be aware that the Soviet Union had this rich history of science fiction, both of science fiction literature, of course, but, going as far back as, say, 1908, Alexander Bogdanov's Red Star, the first Bolshevik utopia, going back to way before the revolution, really, but also in cinema, 1924, right? Yakov Protazanov's Aelita, which was one of the earliest full-length feature films in the genre that was made anywhere in the world. Some say it is the first science fiction movie on the global stage. But what happened with the American hyper-awareness of Sputnik in 1957, that this is when we beef up our science education, right? I mean, it changed everything. It changed K-12 schools, it changed universities, and it also suddenly made American readers and fans aware of this whole scene. On the Soviet side, though, the history is also equally uneven and heterogeneous, because your early 20th century science fiction was not really a thing in terms of official literature, right? It's not socialist realism. In fact, science fiction during the Stalin years had been driven underground for almost 3 decades, right? So there was these limits in the Soviet context that were put on the imagination, on the horizon of the imagination. After this, suddenly comes 1957, Sputnik, the whole world's eyes turn towards this little soccer ball sized thing, right, that the Soviet released. And this does something magical to the whole genre and the relationship with the genre in Soviet society and politics and culture. In other words, science fiction suddenly becomes legit. It's okay to play with it.
Dr. Bannerджи says the launch of Sputnik and the sudden legitimization of science fiction not only opened the doors to new authors and creators, but it also instigated an archival process wherein the Soviet Union returned to those underground texts from the Stalin years and cited them as evidence of the USSR's rich heritage in the genre.
What for me is most interesting in the late 50s and the 60s that is happening is that in the Soviet Union, there is this major archival project of recuperating our rich history of science fiction, where we were like way ahead of the West in our imaginative horizons way back when. So all of these classics, Tsiolkovsky, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the grandfather of the Soviet space program, right? Khrushchev posthumously honored him on the Red Square. So Tsiolkovsky wrote science fiction. That was his medium. In 1895, he wrote his first science fiction story called Na Lune, on the moon. And then he wrote a lot of science fiction. It's not brilliant literature, but it was also his ideas, which were really far out and crazy sounding back in those days. Nobody really recognized him as a legitimate scientist. So all the way, here is our heritage. There was this whole heritage project that the space age started as far as science fiction, as a serious mode of social education in the Soviet Union. And so all kinds of people who don't fit the normative boundaries on literature, came rushing back, were republished.
There's a specific example of one of these reclaimed stories that stands out in Dr. Banerjee's memory. In fact, it involves a story that helped hook her interest in Russian science fiction even as a child, an adventure novel written by Alexander Belyaev in 1928 titled Amphibian Man. The book is about an Argentinian doctor who gives his son a set of shark gills in an operation to save the boy's life, but the procedure renders him largely unable to interact with the world outside the water, creating a tale of survival under extreme conditions and questioning the general moral integrity of scientific experiments. If that plot sounds vaguely familiar to modern moviegoers, it may be because it loosely resembles Guillermo del Toro's 2017 fantasy drama, The Shape of Water, where the humanoid fish creature in the movie is credited at the end as the Amphibian Man, an homage, Dr. Banerjee believes, to the USSR's 1962 film adaptation of Belyaev's book.
It's a really sad story because he was a best-selling author. 1962, Vladimir Chebotaryov takes this novel called The Amphibian Man and makes it into this brilliant experiment in underwater cinema. So he wanted Jacques Cousteau, who was doing his marine television series in France at that time. They couldn't afford Cousteau, so they went ahead and made a Soviet project of it. The setting is Buenos Aires, the Rio de la Plata river estuary. They went to Baku to simulate it, right, on their low budget. And there are all kinds of interesting kind of constraints on infrastructure and equipment in that movie. But what to me is fascinating is that in 1962, it was okay to go back and adapt a story written by this writer who was really disgraced by the Union of Soviet Writers in the 1930s and driven to despair, and to make that story into a new internationalist kind of film language. Also, the newly decolonizing Global South alliances between the Soviet Union and that friendship of the people, everything is there in that very popular, made for popular consumption. It did become a very, very popular movie. It was sent to the first Festival of Science Fiction Cinema in Trieste, Italy, the following year, 1963. But you know what is really cool? If you saw Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, which won Best Film and the Oscars a few years ago.
The only thing that comes to mind is a poem whispered by someone in love hundreds of years ago. Unable to perceive the shape of you, I find you all around me. Your presence fills my eyes with your love. It humbles my heart, for you are everywhere.
That is a kind of a flip of The Amphibian Man, this 1962 film. I'm not sure if Del Toro is familiar with the original novel from 1928, but in the credits even, that creature is credited as the Amphibian Man, which I don't think is coincidental. More than that, the setting of Guillermo del Toro's film, The Shape of Water, is Baltimore in 1962. And of course, it's a Soviet-American spy novel as well. And I happened upon a Bengali translation of The Amphibian Man on my neighbor's shelf when I was maybe 12 or 13. And so that was my first encounter that sucked me in. And then I saw the movie with my dad. and that's what got us started.
What drew you to the book? I mean, it was just... Did it have like an interesting cover art, or what among all the books drew you to that one?
You know, it had a beautiful Art Deco type of cover.
Unfortunately, this is the part of the podcast where the show's purely audio nature comes up short. As the father of a 10-year-old girl, plus some younger kids who don't yet read, I really wanted to know what kind of cover art is gripping enough to get a child to want to read a book from the 1920s about a fish man. If you want to see the cover art for yourself, please check Medusa's website, where I've published an image of the exact books that inspired Dr. Banerjee in her childhood. The artwork is indeed very cool. The 1962 film Amphibian Man is on YouTube. You can watch all 96 minutes of it free of charge. Whether it's a pirated copy and illegally present on the site, I don't know. I looked it over, but I confess that I found it very hard to enjoy. Honestly, like most movies from before the late 1970s, just a few years before I was born. The set design, the makeup, the costumes, everything looks cheap in comparison to the action I've come to know and expect in science fiction movies. Even when you compare the very best of the best in Russia and Hollywood, it seems obvious to me that classics like Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was released in 1968, are infinitely more captivating and visually spectacular than even the pinnacle of Soviet science fiction movies like, say, Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris or Stalker. This confidence in the unchallenged dominance of American movies, however, is some quintessential American thinking, and it's a bit narrow-minded, warns Dr. Banerjee.
Hollywood, of course, is a giant. It's an engine of globalization with tremendous resources. But are we constructing the proper frame to compare, right, the two industries? Because a lot of popular Soviet science fiction movies did get distributed quite widely. And here you have to flip the map. Maybe not in the US, but all over the global South. In Latin America, where did Guillermo del Toro get his thing? One day I intend to ask him. And so, this is an actual archival question for me to ask the filmmaker. So in Africa, in Asia, Soviet science fiction films were all over the place, and books too, translated. So this is, if you will, a counter-hierarchical project that has always been part of my fascination with science fiction in the Soviet Union. So I think we need to triangulate your question rather than divide it into two parts, the US versus Soviet, into the Cold War as a global thing.
What you're also saying is that it's possible that Americans just don't realize how popular Soviet science fiction movies were or are.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that American audiences and critics are perhaps a little more provincial than they like to think of themselves.
I want to return to that internet meme I described at the top of the show, the comparison of alien monsters in Soviet and Hollywood science fiction movies. I first saw the image in a Twitter thread shared by Slavoj Malamud, a sports journalist and a math teacher with Moldovan roots who now lives in the United States. Slava established himself as a colorful, insightful commentator on Soviet cinema and cinema about the USSR when HBO's Chernobyl miniseries aired a couple of years ago. His tweets recalling his stepfather's experience as part of the USSR's military cleanup following the nuclear disaster even attracted the attention of Chernobyl showrunner Craig Mazin. Regular listeners of this podcast will recognize that Slava joined me about a year ago to discuss Red Dawn and Hollywood's sort of comical vilifications of Russians in movies throughout the 1980s. The internet meme comparing sci-fi movie monsters in the USSR and the USA annoyed him too. I asked him why.
There are several levels of wrongness about this very broad generalization based on on a few cherry-picked pictures of aliens. The first one is obviously because Soviet movie industry was not able to create monsters for purely technical reasons. And this goes the same for, if you look at the Soviet movie industry in the 80s, it was probably in pretty much the same place where the American one was in the 50s and 60s. So if you look at Star Trek in the 60s, most of the aliens there are very humanoid. And the aliens that are there, maybe for one episode, they could, make it some kind of a crude depiction of a non-humanoid alien. But, the Klingons, they're just basically Klingons. They just have darker skin. That's about it. They're just humans. And that's how the Soviets approached it. They would make most of their aliens as humanoid as possible because that was just the only way they could create it. And it's not just science fictions. There's no such thing as horror films in the Soviet Union. There's no such thing as really gory, violent films except for World War II. That's where we were okay with portraying gratuitous violence in a very heroic way. And it wasn't because of our benevolence, but it was simply because our culture was very rigidly censored, and there was very direct, strict ideas about what's proper and what's not proper to portray on stage in film, on TV, what's proper and not proper to talk about in the music, in the literature even. So everything was very conservative. And the third thing is the overreaching idea that we were not as xenophobic as Americans. Well, no, we were. The only thing is, it was a different type of xenophobia. The United States, by virtue of being an isolated nation and also a superpower, tends to not care about what other countries think about them. Americans tend to be very self-contained. Americans have their own musical culture, and then their own sports and their own food culture, and they don't like borrowing from other countries because generally, it's just far away. And Americans have this sense of superiority. The Soviets also have a sense of superiority, which is also somehow very, very closely tied to a very deep-seated inferiority complex. Because we think we're great, we think we're amazing, but we also think we're deeply misunderstood, and nobody can ever get us right. And we always earn for approval from foreign nations. At the same time, not just approval, we want the foreign nations to recognize how amazingly great and awesome we are. Whereas Americans couldn't give a damn. The Russians want foreigners to come to them and tell them, your ballet is the best. Your soccer is really not that horrible. There's a whole industry in Soviet journalism and in Soviet movie making about making foreigners approve of us. But it doesn't mean we're not xenophobic. It doesn't mean we're more open to the world. It simply means we're less secure in who we are.
What about in terms of like the power of popular culture when it comes to science fiction? This is maybe more true of Americans today than it was even during any point in the Cold War. But when I think of like the popular appeal of science fiction right now, there is like hard sci-fi that has to do with space exploration and things like that. But I think that probably a lot of the superhero movies, they qualify as science fiction. Some of them are very science fiction. And you've got kids dressing up as characters from these films, and they're probably not reading the books about them, but maybe they're reading the comic books, I guess. Like that's not unheard of, obviously. And so I wonder, is there anything in Soviet science fiction that carries similar appeal? Because I know I've had Russian friends who grew up reading science fiction. It's a part of their identity, but it's not so much. It's not like it wasn't necessarily cosplay for them the way it is for Americans. Like, how do those two compare?
American comic book culture, especially the superhero culture, is not something that was possible in the Soviet Union. Simply because all of our culture was very politicized and very rigidly ideologized. Science fiction had to defend a certain type of idea that was compatible or aligned with the party ideals. And a superpowered individual who goes, who can do amazing thing all by his own is not really a party ideal. We're more about the collective and the historical imperative and the class struggle. So when you read science fiction of the classical Soviet authors of the olden days, it's all about very high space exploration, space opera, where these heroic cosmonauts are conquering the galaxy, and in some really over-the-top examples, probably fighting like Mars capitalism, trying to liberate the Martian working class. But in some of the better examples, it's more about the idea. It's more about the advancement of human knowledge. It's more about the advancement of human thought. And so obviously it was not the same way. And we didn't have a superhero culture at all. But our better authors, like the Strugatsky brothers, who are definitely the best Soviet adult-oriented science fiction writers, they tried to make it more about who we are as humans. They tried to make it about the conflicts that tear us apart. Maybe some of their aliens and alien cultures are basically just reflections of our base self. So they have this whole series about humans in the 23rd, 24th century, advancing beyond the bounds of the solar system and not really conquering, but exploring other planets and trying to maybe steer them on the right path. But it always ends disastrously because you can't mess around with other cultures without, facing the repercussions and without, the law of unintended consequences type of thing. It's very Star Trek-y in this way. Star Trek with its prime directive, but it's less idealistic than Star Trek and probably more realistic. And again, it doesn't have anything to do with us being more open to foreign cultures. It's just these two intellectual writers exploring humanity through this vehicle. And Kira Bulichov, who was more of a children-oriented writer, he did put some scary monsters in there. He had some conflict.
Do you think that Soviet science fiction movies would have had broader appeal internationally if they'd had like the kind of budgets and special effects that we see in Hollywood today? Because I mean, like some of the best like Soviet science fiction movies, they are respected and even beloved by cinephiles outside of the Soviet Union today, but it's still a very narrow audience, I think, because and this is I was just rewatching bits of what is it, Kin-dza-dza? Is that how you say it?
Cool.
And it's a wonderful movie, but the pacing is so slow and the set design is so minimalistic. I mean, like it contributes. It works with like what they're trying to do. But while I was doing the dishes yesterday, I was watching like Captain of America Civil War, and they're like throwing cars at each other, and like granted that's much lower entertainment, but it grabbed my eye.
We have some weapon systems offline.
Hey, what?
Oh, you're gonna have to take this into the shop.
Who's speaking?
It's your conscience. We don't talk a lot these days.
Friday?
Deploying fire suppression system.
And that has to do with who was making these movies. Because Kin-dza-dza was made by Danelia, who is known for his comedies for the most part. And he made this into this very satirical, very tongue-in-cheek comic, basically parody of the science fiction genre. And it is very, very minimalistic. And it's intentionally so. And it's all he's using tremendous actors in there. And and the way they interact to the Soviet perestroika era, late 80s era viewers, it'll be very recognizable. I mean, the characters, even the alien characters, are very recognizable. And it's a big metaphor. There's for racism, for classism. And, we'd be watching it and we're like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. But it wouldn't probably play with Western audiences in 2021 the same way. And then you look at Stalker, the famous film made by Tarkovsky, and it's based on the Strugatsky brothers novels. But it's made by Tarkovsky, which means like there's 3.5 people in the world who love it, and maybe 10 people who understand it. It's very, very highbrow cinematography. It's brilliantly made, but it's not mass entertainment for sure.
In that Twitter thread that I mentioned earlier, you said that watching The Running Man in 1988, a year after it was released in the States, it turned your world on its head. And I wondered if you could say more about both like the experience of seeing this movie, and I imagine others like it, was a moment in your life that you remember to this day. And I was wondering if you could just describe for, say, like the Americans listening to this podcast, like what did it feel like to discover the 80s action movie as a Soviet guy?
Well, that was the first real American film I ever watched.
It's real, man. That's as real as it gets too. I'll agree with that.
And I'm even struggle to remember what American-made films I saw before. Oh yeah, there's like The Magnificent Seven, some of the westerns, spaghetti westerns, which are like Italian-American, and Tarzan, which were actually brought by the Soviet soldiers as trophies from Germany after World War II. So the 50s and the 60s, the Soviet baby boom generation grew up watching Tarzan. That was a huge deal. But the first like real non-approved American film I ever saw was The Running Man in 88. I remember it was during the Euro 88. That's how I remember it. I was at my friend's house in Odessa, and they had a VCR. So they popped the tape in, and the VCR did not have a decoder. So from the Palsicam to the VHS system. So it was black and white, and it was dubbed horribly. All the characters were in one voice, a very nasal, very grating Russian voice, who actually, the guy who did, that guy did all American films by himself, all the characters, and he's a legend now in Russia. Like everybody associates Hollywood with that the guy sounded like he had a 40-year-old nasal problem. I mean, it's real bad. But anyway, the film completely destroyed all of my perceptions of what the movie is. I never seen a horror film before. I never seen an action film before. I've never seen Schwarzenegger before, and I never knew people could be like that. And every single scene from the beginning to the end, and the first scene of that movie is a helicopter mowing down people with machine guns. And then after this is just nonstop action, nonstop, really over-the-top characters being killed in over-the-top ways by this incredible piece of meat, and always delivering one-liners, poorly translated, but still.
I'll be back. Only in a rerun.
Me and my big mouth. We should have taken that trip to Hawaii.
I had the shot for it, but you fucked it up. Drop dead! I don't do requests. Here is Sub-Zero! Now, Plane Zero! Hey!
Hey, ты! Ёлка новогодняя!
And I spent the next 2 months, I think, because I saw it in the summer and I was not in school. I spent the next 2 months retelling this film frame by frame to every single one of my friends until they got absolutely annoyed with me and tired and tried to avoid me. I guess it loses a lot in retelling, but it was just such an enormously life-changing experience for me. And around that time, Schwarzenegger, Stallone, and Jackie Chan and Chuck Norris, all of these action films became very, very popular in the Soviet Union. So all of my friends suddenly had all the posters around the walls of these guys. And I tried to see as many films with them as possible. So what happened was late 80s, early 90s, they had the illicit, they called them video salons, spring up all over the country. And basically what the video salon was somebody's basement where you would go, you pay 1 ruble, which was twice as much as any movie in a Soviet movie theater would usually cost. You paid 1 ruble, usually to a guy with tattooed fingers, who, and then you'd sit around in a semicircle on chairs around the regular TV, and a guy would come in, pop in the videotape, and you'd hear that same nasal voice again, but now it's mostly in color. And they only ever showed 2 genres. One was what they called boyevik, which meant violent action film, usually with some kind of a karate-based plot. And the other was called pornucha, which was porn, mostly light porn or just erotica.
The circle came in handy for those, I imagine.
Yeah, and I mean, for most Soviet citizens, any view of a female breast was hardcore porn. So we had low standards. But that was, and I remember like handwritten bills or handwritten billboards all over the place in my and they were advertising films like The Killer Cyborg, which was Terminator.
Yeah.
And what else was the big ones? Oh, Alpha Force was huge. Everybody loved it. Oh, look, it's the Arabs. They're supposed to be our friends, and this American guy is kicking them. Yeah. That was great. Oh, Rocky and Rambo, obviously, especially the ones when the Soviets are the bad guys. That was just the whole exotic value of watching us as the bad guys, and especially very unrealistically depicted as they are in Rocky 4 and Rambo 3. That was a hoot. That was like a comedy. It was so great. It was just being subversive, watching that crap, being subversive, watching violence, and at the same time being entertained by very unrealistic portrayals of the Soviets. That was like a triple whammy. It was huge.
You've been listening to the Naked Pravda, an English language podcast from Meduza. On today's show, we heard from Anindita Bannerджи, an associate professor of comparative literature at Cornell University, where she chairs the Humanities Concentration in the Environment and Sustainability Program, and wears several other academic and administrative hats. Also, I spoke to journalist Slava Malamud about his personal experiences watching Soviet and American science fiction in the USSR in the 1980s. The Naked Pravda is a podcast from Meduza. It's our only English language show. And I hope you'll recommend us to your friends and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are tuning in. It will help put this program in front of more ears. Thank you for listening, and come back soon.